Good morning, friends. It's Saturday, and I'm back with Chapter 17 of my upcoming book, Campaign at Fort Stix. Now it's time to grab a snack, dim the lights, and let me take you into the mists of time with a story I call Testing Limits. Landing softly in the hay, I rolled over laughing at my cousin's reactions. This small 10-foot jump was nothing to me, especially with the soft hay to land on. I was used to jumping from the eaves of garages and houses and landing in the grass in our backyard. I gained this experience the year before when I was testing parachute theory, which began with the Mary Poppins jump. Yes, I tried to use an umbrella for a parachute. The result? One umbrella ruined as it folded upwardly permanently and a sore bottom after my mom found out. Bed sheet and canvas testing produced similar results, which is why I was so interested in rappelling. Gathering myself up, I led the way back down the ladder to Paul, and then all four of us exited the barn. While they did not say anything, I think Mark and Michael were impressed with my jump. As we exited the barn, I looked back up at the hay and began to have an idea for what we might do in the next few days if not otherwise preoccupied. The tiers of hay could be more easily accessed if we were to make stairs with hay bales. Emerging into the sun once again, I relished the warmth, feeling it energize me. I looked around the yard, but nothing caught my eye. Mark said he needed to use the bathroom, so we walked over to the garage and waited for him. In the garage, I saw a bunch of fishing poles stacked in a corner and wondered where there was to fish. I asked and was told there were several creeks nearby where we could catch fish. I was all for this, and after prying all of the pertinent geographical data from my cousins, set to planning a scouting mission. I had noticed a lot of worms and night crawlers in the soil of my aunt's garden. Since we were gardening and not gathering fish bait, I left them alone. Now, they were needed. As I began to plan the mission, it occurred to me that unlike at home, where I could plan and execute at will, here there might be special conditions considering the elevated discipline levels encountered. Would this be allowed only on certain days? Would long-range weather forecasts and flood charts need to be consulted? Would there be other things to consider, such as bovine migration patterns? I soon found myself dismayed at the endless possibilities, so I consulted the expert on local regulations. "Hey Mark," I started, "are we allowed to go to the creeks and fish without having an adult with us?" "Oh yeah," he said, smiling. "We just have to ask Papa the night before and have chores done before we go." This sounded rather simple to me, and not at all as complicated as I imagined. Was it really that easy to just ask permission and be allowed to do something? "Okay, great," I said. "Here's what we need to do. First, we need a container to put worms in. Then we need to go to the garden and dig up a bunch of worms so we will have them ready. Then, tonight, you ask your dad if you can show me places you guys like to fish." "We need to ask Mama for permission to dig in her garden first," Mark said. "We are not allowed in the garden unless Mama is there." "Well, okay," I said. "Let's go ask her." "We have to wait until we're called for dinner," Mark said. "Mama gets upset if we interrupt her afternoon unless it's an emergency. She says the couple hours between lunch and dinner is busy with cooking and getting her correspondence done." Well, I certainly did not want to upset my aunt. She might object to our planned expedition. But it was crucial that we get bait today, or we would end up being late to the creek and miss the early bite. The increased discipline of the current environment was proving to be a challenge. I looked around as I thought about the problem. How could we get bait today? At that moment, I noticed my aunt had removed my skateboard from the laundry room and placed it on the back porch. I needed time to think, and there was nothing like adrenaline to help get the mind working. I led them toward the porch so I could grab my skateboard. "You guys want to see something cool?" I asked and headed for the road out in front of the house. As I stepped onto the road, I saw we were at the top of the hill and could see down both sides and up to the top of the hills on either side. To the right was maybe a quarter mile to the top of the next hill. To the left looked closer to a half a mile. I also noticed Michael and Paul had not stepped from the grass along the ditch. "Are you guys coming?" I asked, looking at Mark beside me. "We're not allowed to play in the road or leave the grass unless Papa is here with us," Michael responded. "Okay, well, you can see from there," I said and stepped onto the skateboard. "Keep an eye out both ways and let me know if any cars come over the hills so I can get out of the road." They agreed this was a good idea and watched as I began to ride. The road was asphalt and not the smooth asphalt of a new city street. This was rough and weathered with the surface more like compacted pebbles than asphalt. I pushed myself along the top of the hill several times and noticed my motion was impeded by the rough road, as if I had brakes on my skateboard. After a few minutes of trying to ride and do tricks on the top of the hill, I was getting tired. I had already fallen a couple times at slow speed. I was not used to the skateboard slowing so much. I decided I might get a better ride if I rode downhill, so I positioned myself for a downhill run along the edge of the road. Giving myself several kicks to get going, I planted my feet, knees bent slightly, arms out to the side for stabilization, and headed down the long side of the hill since it was not as steep as the short side. Very quickly I began to pick up speed. The wind was racing past my face, and I was not being slowed by the road now. In fact, I was gaining speed. A lot of speed. Too much speed, I realized when I was a bit less than halfway down. At the rate I was picking up speed, I would be going well in excess of "this is going to hurt" by the time I got to the bottom. I felt panic begin to rise in my throat. Or maybe that was bile. Either way, I did not like it and fought to maintain calm. At this point in my career, I had never ridden my skateboard in a cement pool or on a half-pipe ramp, where acceleration down one side is diminished by going up the other side. My experience was limited to smooth roads and church parking lots, where I would drag a foot behind if acceleration exceeded comfort levels. Looking ahead, I determined my speed would be well past comfortable by the time I reached the bottom and leveled out in the valley. As I considered applying the foot brake, I thought about the roughness of the road and how similar it had felt to sandpaper when I fell on top of the hill earlier. I was wearing canvas tennis shoes. The idea of dragging these shoes on the rough surface seemed like a bad idea. My speed increased above the point where the skateboard began to wobble and shake as an oscillation set in. It looked like I was steering right and left very quickly, when in fact, I was not. The skateboard was doing this on its own. The higher the speed, the faster the wobble, and I knew eventually it was going to throw me off. I bent my knees to lower my center of gravity and prepare for the roll I knew was coming. I figured when the board threw me, I would tuck and roll off to the side of the road in the soft grass. What I failed to anticipate was increased speed because my lower body profile provided less wind resistance. Almost immediately after kneeling down, my speed increased dramatically. I decided it would be necessary to ditch the board in order to minimize the pain that was coming. I calculated a trajectory off the side of the road into the grass and prepared myself for the inevitable. It was at that moment a thought occurred to me. I did not have to dig in the garden for worms. There was a mulch pile where my aunt made her compost. Some of the easiest worm catching I ever did was in piles of wet leaves. All we would have to do is turn over the compost and pick out the worms. The thought of these easy pickings for worms put a smile on my face, and I'm sure my cousins must have thought I was having the time of my life, right up to the point where I leaned sharply to turn the skateboard into the shoulder. The skateboard shuddered beneath my feet as it veered toward the shoulder, and I prepared to wrap my arms around my head to prevent damage. This was the 70s, and as far as I knew, helmets, elbow, and knee pads had not been yet invented. The grass came up fast, and as the first wheels rolled from the asphalt, they came into contact with loose gravel at the side of the road. Attaching a rope to the back of the skateboard and allowing it to roll to the end of the rope would have had the same effect as the rocks. The shuddering stopped suddenly as the board planted itself in the gravel, sending me toppling onward at a relatively unsafe velocity. I wrapped my arms around my head and tried to roll as I hit the ground, but instead crumpled into a heap and flopped over several times until coming to rest flat on my back. I heard one of my cousins yell, "Wow, that was cool!" Lying in the grass looking at the blue sky, I did not feel any real pain. Sure, there were a couple of sore spots, but no real agonizing pain as I had anticipated. Then two faces appeared above me, grinning, and I found I had not lost my breath. "The mulch pile," I said. "We can get worms from the mulch pile and not even go into the garden." They helped me to my feet and I grabbed my skateboard. There were a few rocks stuck in the clear rubber of the wheels, and they had pockmarks where little chunks of rubber were missing. I guess the rough roads had been too hard on the wheels, but knew I had spares at home, so it was no big deal. Ascending the long hill took a lot longer than coming down, but we finally reached the top and went back by the house. I put the skateboard on the back porch and grabbed the water hose to get a drink. The cold well water tasted great, and when I was done drinking, I handed the hose to Mark as I looked upon a future conquest for the first time. Standing close to the big tree, by the side of the house, was a windmill. A very tall windmill, made from a steel tube frame with angle iron cross bracing. A ladder went up the inside of the frame all the way to the stretched mesh steel platform just below the blade. On the concrete pad at the base sat a water pump, but the rod connecting it to the shaft from the blade was missing. Instead, at the top, just under the platform, something big and brown hung there. "What is that hanging up there?" I asked. "I don't know," Mark said, "but Papa has said the windmill is off limits. If he catches us messing around or climbing on it, we will get the switch." My first thought to this response was that Papa was at work and therefore would not know what we were doing. Then I remembered about fishing and stored the windmill away for another time. Right now, we needed to find a suitable container for worms and secure our bait for tomorrow. I followed Mark to the garage where we found several peanut cans with plastic lids. These were smaller than coffee cans, but I decided they would be easier to carry than coffee cans. We weren't going fishing on a boat after all, and would have to carry everything. We rinsed the dust from a couple of cans and headed for the mulch pile. There was a lot of heat coming from the pile, despite the sun not being very hot. I had my doubts that we would actually find any worms there at first, but I was determined to try, and used a small garden rake to dig into the edge of the decaying vegetation. Just as the digging got a little harder at the bottom, I turned over a smelly clump of grass and leaves to find it absolutely crawling with redworms and nightcrawlers. In less than 10 minutes, we had more than enough bait. We covered the worms in the cans with wet leaves from the pile and stored them in a cool corner of the garage. As we left the garage, I noticed my uncle's car was now in the driveway and the sun was getting pretty low on the horizon. We washed our hands and got a drink at the water hose, and had just sat down on the steps of the back porch when my aunt stepped out to call us in for dinner. She looked at my cousins and then looked to me and shook her head as she smiled. "Looks like you managed to have an enjoyable afternoon," she said. "Come on, you boys go wash up and change for dinner." I took my shoes off at the back door like my cousins and followed them inside and upstairs. I looked at them as we climbed the stairs and noticed that they were all pretty clean. Looking down at myself, I saw streaked green stripes on my shirt and pants from where I hit the grass from the skateboard. My knees were stained dark brown from kneeling and digging in the mulch pile, and there were streaks of cherry and raspberry juice on my shirt and pants. I had to agree. It looked like I had a great time. I was not sure what my aunt meant by washing up and changing before dinner until Mark came out of the bathroom. He was wearing pajamas, and his hair was wet. "Wow, did you take a bath?" I asked. "No, just a quick shower," Mark said. "I made sure to leave you plenty of hot water." With that, he headed off downstairs, and I heard him talking to my uncle in the den. I went back to the guest room and found clean pajamas sitting on the end of the bed with a clean towel. I took them and went to the bathroom, where I found a laundry basket sitting by the bathtub. Mark's clothes from the day were in the basket. I put my dirty clothes in the basket, showered quickly, and put on the pajamas. At home, I usually did not take a bath or shower until just before bed. I realized being clean this early in the evening obviously precluded any outdoor activity after dinner. So, if we had waited to get permission to go into the garden, we would not have been able to do it until tomorrow. It was going to take me a bit to get used to things here. I was into more instant gratification and pursuing my thoughts, but here it was almost like playing chess. I would have to think moves ahead in order to do anything. I paused at the doorway to my uncle's den until he told me to come on in and have a seat. Mark was in a chair off to one side of his desk, while Paul and Michael played with some log cabin blocks on the rug in front of the desk. I took a chair next to Mark and watched as my uncle worked to roll up a pack of cigarettes. He paused occasionally to take a drink from his glass on the desk and a drag from his cigarette before resuming his task. Taking a long drink and drag from his cigarette, he looked over to me and smiled. "Mark tells me you took quite a spill on your skateboard today," he said, and rolled another cigarette. "You do not look like you got hurt. How do you feel?" "I'm fine," I grinned at him. "I think the trucks on my skateboard were adjusted too loose for high speed, and the tires were too soft for the road. I got going too fast down the hill and decided to roll into the grass to stop." "So, no cuts or broken bones?" he asked. "No, sir. Just some bumps, and I might have a bruise where my knee hit my elbow when I was rolling." "Glad to hear it," he said, starting to pack the cigarettes he rolled into a box. "So what are your plans for skateboarding after this?" "I think I might have to wait till I get home," I said. "The tires are pitted and not right for the road." He sat back in his chair looking at me silently for a few moments. I couldn't tell what he was thinking and silently reviewed my day to see if I had done anything he wouldn't approve of. He might not like my jumping in the hayloft, I thought, but other than that, I think I was good. "What are your plans for tomorrow?" he asked. I looked to Mark, who was now looking at me over the top of the book he was reading and smiling. I took this as encouragement. "Would it be okay if Mark showed me the creeks for fishing?" I asked hopefully. "He says they are pretty close." "I think that would be a great idea," my uncle said as he got up from his chair. "Now, let's go get dinner." I was surprised once more when we all sat at the table for dinner. After saying grace, my aunt and uncle talked quietly as they ate, while my cousins and I ate happily. The food was excellent, and it was not a somber occasion as I expected. No, much like breakfast, it was a happy time of talk and laughter that made me wonder why I thought that it would be any different. Perhaps it was because the other times I had shared a meal with them was at holidays when there were a lot of grown-ups around. And of course, our grandmother. She loved us to death, but she was a strict authoritarian in matters of social graces. So these other times we were together, of course, we were all on our best behavior because no one wanted to be corrected with Grandma's favorite, the house shoe. Lying in bed that evening, I perused through one of my magazines, but I was not really interested in reading. I was thinking about fishing in the morning, and was a bit anxious. I did not have an alarm to set, or a tackle box to organize. This was going to be my first on-the-go fishing trip. Get up, grab what was needed, and sort it out once we were on the water. Did we have the right hooks? How was the line on the reels? I woke to the sound of people moving about the house. Getting up, I used the bathroom, washed my face and hands, and got dressed. I arrived in the kitchen in time to see my uncle going out the door and my cousins taking their seats at the breakfast table. "Good morning," my aunt said. "Looks like you slept well last night. Country air'll do that to you." I climbed into a chair at the table beside my cousins. Like the morning before, we said grace, and then breakfast commenced. This morning, I was ready to go fishing, and I wasted no time talking, other than as necessary to be polite. When we finished, we were headed out the back door to the garage to get the fishing poles and head off to the creek where the day's adventure awaited. Except for Paul. Mark said he was not allowed to go to the creek yet because he was too small. He was the same age as my brother back home. And thinking about it, it made sense, as my brother Mark was not allowed to leave the property of our farm when I went wandering. Along the back of the farm, a line of trees marched from the horizon at the west to where they disappeared at the horizon below the sun to the east. When we left the garage, Mark led us along a path from the barn toward these trees, which seemed to be about a half a mile away. It was mostly downhill, and it did not take us long to reach the trees. To my surprise, the creek was in the midst of the trees. I looked back at the house in the distance and wondered why they did not spend every day fishing if the creek was so close. I would have done anything to have a fishable creek this close to the house. Pushing our way through the undergrowth, we emerged onto the bank of a slow-moving creek. The water was clear, and there were a lot of shiny, smooth rocks and pebbles on the bottom. It looked just like the fabled creeks from my outdoor magazines in the mountains out west. Immediately, I scanned the water for signs like I had read about. I looked for where the water rippled around larger rocks and areas where the water moved slower than the stream, indicating a still pool where fish might wait for food. I was living one of my dreams. I had been handed a small ultralight spinning rod and reel to use for this adventure. At first, I was not impressed at seeing how small the spool was and the very light 6-pound test line. I was sure I would be losing fish to such a weak line. Now, seeing the creek, I realized this was necessary so the line would not spook the fish. I tied on a number 12 hook and threaded a lively redworm onto it. With no weight, it would be hard to cast, so I fed out some line as if I was using a fly rod and flipped it into the current in front of me. As the worm drifted in the current, I fed more line and gave gentle pulls to guide it to a rock a little way downstream. When I saw it slip over the rock and start to settle into the pocket behind the rock, I closed the bail and waited. It took no more than 10 seconds before the first fish ate my worm and headed off downstream. I reeled it up and was rewarded with a 6-inch chub. I looked at the chub as it dangled before me. On one hand, I was happy I caught a fish, but this fish was bait for bigger fish. I carefully removed the hook and returned it to the water, watching it dart back to the rock. Okay, at least I knew the fish were feeding. I just had to find where the bass, sunfish, and maybe catfish were hiding. Mark and Michael were fishing a little downstream from where my position was, so I slowly made my way along the bank to where they were. They were also catching chubs and releasing them. Just beyond where they fished, I saw a large, still pool with undercuts in the bank. I knew from reading and experience that bass and catfish like to lay at the edge of deep pools, below undercuts waiting for prey to swim by. At the upstream edge of the pool was a log jutting out just enough that I knew if I was sitting on it, I could drift my bait along the undercut. I slowly made my way to the log and slipped onto it. Reaching into the worm can, I got out a nice fat nightcrawler and completely hid my hook in the end of it. If a fish bit it in half, or even ate most of it without getting the first quarter inch in its mouth, I would not hook it, but I had faith a large fish would inhale the worm. Holding the rod up, I fed enough line to create a large pendulum and swung it to the edge of the creek under the bank. Leaving the bail open, I fed line until I was sure the worm was well into the pool and drifting around on the current, and then closed it. I knew I had to be patient. Mark and Michael walked up behind me, and one of them said something I did not understand. I turned toward them so I could hear better. At that moment, a fish decided it liked my worm, and it was not a little chub. Feeling the hook, the fish launched across the pool, jerking the rod hard toward the water. I turned to see what was happening as the fish lunged and pulled me off the log. 1 second, I was sitting on the log feeling a fish, and the next, I was holding onto the rod as I tried to gain my footing to get my head above water. After several long seconds of thrashing in the water, I managed to get my feet under me and stood up to find myself in the water just over my belt. One hand was holding onto the log while the other held the rod as the fish continued to speed away from me. Realizing I was standing, I let go of the log and grabbed the handle of the reel to fight the fish. It was not having it and lunged a final time to make the line snap. I watched as it created a wake moving downstream away from me, still unable to grasp just what had happened. I had no idea what kind of fish it was. As I regained my wits, I became aware of loud laughter and looked back to see both of my cousins rolling on the ground laughing. Apparently, my surprise swimming session was hilarious. I climbed onto the bank and sat on a log to start drying off. I still had my worm can and the lid was on it, so no harm. I tied another hook on the line and prepared to continue fishing as my cousins caught their breath. I was sure this would be a tale they told for a long time to come. I hope you enjoyed this look into the campaign at Fort Stix. That's all for now, but I'll be back again next week with another story, just for you. Until then, sleep well.